When the European military powers gathered their forces for war in August 1914, the German General Staff realized that time was against them. The chief of the General Staff, Helmuth von Moltke, was convinced that it would take the Russian army 40 days to mobilize. 40 precious days before the lumbering bear would become a threat to Germany's eastern border. As laid out in the Schlieffen Plan, Germany threw the overwhelming majority of its strength west to achieve a decisive victory over the French. Once the French army was defeated, the Kaiser's army would then turn east to meet the Russian army. On July 30th, 1914, Russia began mobilization. 6 days later, the French ambassador pleaded with the Tsar to attack immediately to relieve the pressure on the French army. An invasion of East Prussia by General Rennenkampf's 1st and General Samsonov's 2nd armies was hastily arranged. The Russian steamroller was on the move. Moltke's 40 days vanished. The two Russian armies outnumbered the 10 divisions of the German 8th Army under the command of General von Prittwitz und Gaffron by almost 2-1. With the odds against them, the Germans planned a holding action in Masuria, followed, if needed, by a fighting withdrawal to the strongly fortified lower Vistula River line, there to await reinforcement by the victorious Western Army. The Russian First Army, under the command of Paul von Rennenkampf, crossed into East Prussia on August 17, 1914, and pushed the German army back towards Königsberg. This was not foreseen in the German plan. Eighth Army Commander General Max von Prittwitz, a court favorite who had no combat experience to draw upon, panicked. On August 22nd, Moltke replaced him and his chief of staff and turned command over to Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff. They arrived the next day to begin the war's most formidable strategic partnership. They inherited a critical situation. German civilians were now on the move. It was the fear of the Russian hordes, the terror of Cossacks on horseback, the image of men with slanted eyes raping and pillaging that drove these people from their homes and farms. Ordinarily submissive, they made their painful parting. But the Russian advance was slowing down. Rennenkampf's supplies were running short, and he could not use East Prussia's rail lines to resupply because the Germans had removed the rolling stock, and Russia's was of a different gauge. When the Germans retreated after a brief battle at Gumbinnen, Rennenkampf did not pursue them, but waited 2 days for supplies to catch up. And when he did move on August 23rd, he gave avoiding a German flank attack priority over supporting the Second Army, continuing west towards Königsberg instead of turning south to meet Samsonov. The Second Army had communication and supply problems and was being imprudently urged on by the Army Group Commander, General Zelensky, over sandy soil that made progress difficult for infantry and even harder on the draft horses. The Russians made much use of radios, sending messages in plain text or a simple cipher that was easily broken. On August 23rd, German intelligence intercepted 2 plain text messages. The first giving the distance Rennenkampf's troops were to march on the next day. The second, from Samsonov, with orders for pursuing an army he believed to be in full retreat. They showed the First Army would not be coming to meet the Second. The 50 or so miles of lakeland terrain separating the two armies virtually guaranteed both to be isolated and unable, if not unwilling, to come to the aid of each other. The messages were such an unexpected gift that some German intelligence officers thought that they were a trap. Hindenburg was convinced by the Eighth Army's Chief of Operations, Colonel Maximilian Hoffmann, that the messages were genuine and that the two Russian commanders' mutual dislike would prevent them from cooperating. The Army commander reversed the retreat order and adopted a new plan of action. Leaving two divisions facing Rennenkampf, the Eighth Army raced by rail and hurled the 8 divisions against Samsonov near Tannenberg. On August 25th, General Hermann von Francois was ordered to attack Samsonov's troops in the south. But while waiting for his artillery to arrive, the bold Francois hesitated. On August 28th, Samsonov's Second Army attacked and broke through the German line to open ground approaching the Vistula River. In the process, the Russians exposed their flanks to General Mackensen and Francois. Samsonov continued to drive northwest to Königsberg. With the center of his troops rapidly advancing towards the goal, his right and left flanks were still hanging in the air. Hindenburg saw his chance and ordered his army to strike. On August 29th, Francois's leading infantry reached Willenberg, just inside East Prussia, across from the Russian border. There, they met Mackensen's 17th Corps. Contact between the two armies signaled that Samsonov had been surrounded. Over August 27th through the 31st, Samsonov's army was trapped and annihilated. 18,000 men were killed and 92,000 were captured in 4 days. The Russian invasion force was teetering on the brink of disintegration. On August 29th, the luckless Samsonov, fearing the prospect of facing the Tsar in shame, shot himself in a remote Prussian forest. Meanwhile, Hindenburg then turned on Rennenkampf, and in the Battle of the Masurian Lakes from September 7th through the 17th, drove him out of East Prussia. The Russian army did not disintegrate, but 45,000 were captured, and General Pflug's 10th Army, positioned on Rennenkampf's left, also had to withdraw. By the end of September, the Russians were back along the River Niemen, minus over 250,000 dead, wounded, or captured. Their sacrifice did, however, help France survive. 5 German divisions were rushed from the west in response to Prittwitz's panicky reports, and arrived only after Tannenberg had shown that they were not needed. They were immediately returned west, but arrived too late for the Battle of the Marne. Colonel Dupont, head of French intelligence, later said of the Russians, "Their debacle was one of the elements of victory." It was the 35th day. This is what the Kaiser reminded his ministers during a meeting at his Luxembourg headquarters on the morning of September 4th. It lay halfway between the 31st day since mobilization, when the map drawn by Schlieffen himself showed the German armies poised to begin their descent on Paris, and the 40th, when his calculations determined that here would have been a decisive battle. That battle's outcome was critical. Schlieffen had calculated that the deficiencies of the Russian railways would ensure that not until the 40th day would the Tsar's armies be assembled in sufficient strength to launch an offensive. After the BEF had escaped his clutches, General Kluck was freed from Bülow's direct command on August 27th and headed southwest towards Amiens. By August 28th, the BEF was less of a priority to him, as he began to consider wheeling inwards, a move which might enable him to push General Lanrezac away from Paris and to roll up the French Fifth Army's left. At this juncture, Joffre ordered an unenthusiastic Lanrezac to turn his face to the west and counterattack between Guise and Saint-Quentin. The Germans were surprised by the strength of the opposition, against which they began to suffer heavy losses. Yet, on August 29th, the Grand Corps and the Hanoverians of 10th Corps advanced some 3 miles, and as evening approached, were preparing to consolidate the ground won. At that moment, the character of the battle was transformed by the courage of one man. The prestigious Guard Corps of the Second Army and the Hanoverians were assaulted at Guise by the French First Corps, commanded by the energetic Franchet d'Espèrey. Mounted on a chestnut charger, surrounded by his staff at the head of the regiments, Franchet d'Espèrey ordered the colors unfurled and the bands to play. With banners flying, corps artillery thundering overhead, Desperate Frankie, as the British admiringly christened the French fire eater, led his red-trouser infantry into the attack. It was the last of the old-time pageants of war, and it worked. They threw the Germans back. Without seeking Moltke's prior agreement, on August 30th, Kluck ordered the First Army to execute the wheel inwards. Instead of passing west of the French capital as planned, the First Army would pass northeast of it. This exposed Kluck's flank to attack by Menor's French Sixth Army, now positioned north of Paris. The straining Schlieffen plan broke down at last. With both events and his subordinates rapidly slipping beyond control, Moltke tamely gave his blessing to Kluck's maneuver. The glittering opportunity offered by Kluck's swerve inwards was not immediately appreciated by the Allies. One effect of the move was to bring Kluck back into contact with the BEF.
A place called Villers-Cotterêts, which when the nearness of Paris began to penetrate our tiredness, and we noticed the kilometre stones at the side of the road. Gradually, we were getting nearer and nearer to Paris, 25, 24, 23. We couldn't believe it was happening to us, but every step nearer to Paris, as witnessed by these kilometre stones, were another blow on the head, which increased our depression, and we mentally felt that should we reach zero, that is Paris itself, that as far as we were concerned, we'd have lost the war.
Having retreated 200 miles, the BEF crossed the Marne on September 3rd, but aerial reconnaissance revealed the vulnerability of Kluck's left flank. On September 4th and 5th, von Moltke issued the orders that would set into motion the decisive battle the Schlieffen Plan envisioned. Von Moltke realized on September 4th that the enemy had eluded the enveloping attack of First and Second Armies and had succeeded in gaining contact with the defensive positions protecting Paris. First and Second Armies were therefore ordered to take a defensive position. Third Army was to advance towards the Upper Seine. Fourth and Fifth Armies were to attack to the southeast with the objective of opening a way for the Sixth and Seventh to complete the encirclement of the enemy. This was the opposite of what Schlieffen had intended. Joffre was quick to see this.
When, on the afternoon that he decided on the Battle of the Marne, I've never seen, very few people have ever seen anybody with such a burden placed on his shoulders, with nobody to help, just weighing the pros and cons of this movement and that movement, what orders to issue. It lasted quite a long time, perhaps a couple of hours. And then he got up, his decision was taken.
For 15 days, the Germans had been advancing on Paris. By September 4th, they were less than 20 miles from the city. Hope waned, and time was running out. At French headquarters on September 4th, Joffre had issued General Instruction Number 6, which exactly anticipated Moltke's recognition of his predicament and proposed a means to exploit it. Accordingly, the Sixth Army, at the outermost extremity, was to cross the Urk, a tributary of the Marne, and advance around the German flank, while the BEF, the Fifth Army, and Foch's Ninth Army were to make a fighting advance northward. The effect date of the order was September 6th. The Germans, not the French army, were to be the target of encirclement. What stood in the way of the conception of the order and the completion of the maneuver were water barriers, tributaries to the Marne that would define the coming battle. Those waterways would define the line of action, and that line would favor the Germans, along with the quick thinking by a commander on the spot at a critical moment. That man was General von Granau, an artillery officer commanding 4th Reserve Corps. On the morning of September 5th, as Manoury's 6th Army probed forward to take up an attacking position for the following day, von Granau received a disquieting report from his cavalry scouts. The mounted patrols located advancing French troops all across the front. 4th Reserve Corps was aligned at right angles to the rear of von Kluck's 1st Army. That meant that the enemy was maneuvering to take 1st Army in the flank and roll it up. Von Granau's response was instantaneous and courageous. He decided to attack. As Manoury's advance guard moved in a line abreast forward towards the Ork in the mid-morning of September 5th, they were suddenly brought under fire by the Germans, who were occupying terrain thought empty. The French went to ground. As darkness fell, von Granau wisely judged he had won the time necessary to save 1st Army from surprise attack and disengaged his troops. In bright moonlight, the French followed, launching attacks against positions the Germans had already abandoned. Thanks to von Granau's independent action, the beckoning open flank which offered the opportunity for encirclement had been covered, and von Kluck given the warning necessary to hurry reinforcements from his center to the right before the danger increased. A portion of the garrison of Paris was rushed to the front by commandeered taxicabs. They prevented a total collapse of the French army, but they could not prevent Manoury's units from being pushed back. Kluck's further movement westwards again extended the gap between the German 1st and 2nd Armies. Bülow, too, had responded capably to the pressure exerted by the French 5th Army and the newly created 9th Army under General Foch. By the third day, the Allied counterstroke was faltering in several places. It had been repulsed with heavy losses. At the crisis of the battle on September 9th, it was the Germans who lost their nerve, the Germans who gave way. As the BEF recrossed the Marne and advanced cautiously into the gap between the two German right-wing armies, an anxious and exhausted Bülow ordered a retreat. His decision was endorsed by Lieutenant Colonel Hensch, a hard-working but impressionable staff officer sent to the front to represent the utterly demoralized Moltke. Kluck was left with no option but to retire northwards to the Aisne with Bülow. The miracle of the Marne saved Paris and dealt the final blow to German plans for a swift victory in the west. While the nerves of Moltke and Bülow had given way, the stolid Joffre had retained his grip, and his reputation and his authority as the savior of France would become unshakable in the following months. Moltke, on the other hand, did not survive long in office. On September 14th, General Erich von Falkenhayn was given control of operations, although to preserve appearances and morale, Moltke kept his post in name only until November 3rd. However, if the Allies had gained a momentous strategic success on the Marne, they were still a very long way from defeating the German armies. Despite their reverse on the Marne, the German right-wing armies fell back to strong positions, especially the Chemin des Dames Ridge, some 4 miles north of the River Aisne between Craon and Soissons. This steep wooded ridge had a series of finger-like spurs extending down towards the Aisne. It was here, on the BEF's line of advance, that a significant gap remained between the German First and Second Armies. The gap was an inviting target for the Allies, but neither the BEF nor neighboring French formations could push on quickly enough to exploit the situation.
I thought our movements very slow today in view of the fact that the enemy is on the run.
Too slow, blown bridges, weary soldiers, cautious commanders, and brave rearguard actions by German troops all combined to delay the Allied advance. The delays cost the Allies dearly. The fall of Maubeuge on September 7th released German troops for other tasks, and the 7th Reserve Corps, under General von Zweil, rushed to plug the gap on the German right. Following a march of 40 miles in 24 hours, during which a quarter of its infantry dropped out, leading elements of the Corps reached the positions along the Chemin des Dames by 2 p.m. on September 13th, 2 hours before the vanguard of Haig's First Corps on the British right approached the crest. Though few recognized it at the time, this was one of the defining moments of the war. The stalemate of trench warfare had arrived on the Western Front.
In front of this corps and for many miles on either side, affairs have reached a deadlock, and no decision seems possible in this area.
And the Germans decided to dig in at that point because it had become a war of stalemate instead of a war of movement. So the Allies built their trenches.
With deadlock gripping the front from the Aisne eastwards, each side tried to turn the other's open flank to the west and north in what became known as the Race to the Sea. Monory's French 6th Army struck first astride the Oise on September 17th, but was blocked near Noyon by the German 9th Reserve Corps moving down from Antwerp. 2 days later, another German corps coming down from Reims stopped an advance over the RV by de Castelnau's Second Army, itself brought from Lorraine to bolster the Allied left. Joffre formed a new 10th Army under General de Monthay, which attempted to get around the German right flank further north, but subsequently struggled early in October to hold Arras against a thrust by 3 German corps. In late September, the French beat back repeated assaults at Verdun, although the German Fifth Army under Crown Prince Wilhelm gained ground in the Argonne Forest, and a troublesome German salient was established on the western bank of the Meuse at Saint-Mihiel. The shape which the Western Front would largely retain until 1918 was fast being molded. Worried about becoming enmeshed in the Aisne stalemate, Sir John French earned Joffre to allow the BEF to disengage and resume its former position on the Allied left. Tactically, the BEF, lacking heavy artillery, but possessing effective cavalry, would be of greater value on the open left flank, while strategically, it seemed sensible to shorten its lines of communication with the Channel ports. Despite the problems which would arise from the passage of British divisions across French lines of communication, Joffre sanctioned the move. On October 1st, the BEF began a sidestep to the Flanders Plain, a region which would become one of the main fields of carnage for the remainder of the war. In the first 3 weeks of October, Smith-Dorrien's Second Corps pushed towards La Bessie, while to the north, Major General Pulteney's Third Corps advanced toward Lille. The Cavalry Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Edmund Allenby, on Pulteney's left, occupied Messines and Wytschaete, linking with the recently formed Fourth Corps, which, after the surrender of Antwerp, was ordered to Ypres. The coordination of operations between Oise and the sea was entrusted by Joffre to Foch, who was appointed to head a new Northern Army group. There was no formal unity of command between the Allies, and Foch had no direct powers over the British and Belgians. But, in practice, his allies, whenever possible, acted upon his proposals rapidly and without friction at this stage of the war. Such cooperation was essential, for Falkenhayn was currently displaying a deft strategic touch, using railways cleverly to gain a vital edge in redeploying and reinforcing his armies. With the Germans setting the pace, the Allies were at a greater risk of being outflanked in late October and early November. The German Sixth Army, which had moved across the front from Lorraine, strove to dislodge the Allies from their positions between La Bassée and Menin. A reconstituted Fourth Army, under Duke Albrecht von Württemberg, closed in on Ypres. The latter formation included 4 new reserve corps, with a large proportion of highly motivated young volunteers from universities and technical colleges, who, although hurriedly trained, offered Falkenhayn a potentially decisive advantage as he sought to outflank the Allied left and drive down the Channel coast. As the German Fourth Army pounded what was left of the Belgian army at Yser, the BEF had largely clung to its defensive positions at Messines, Plugstreet, and La Bassée. The farmland surrounding the Belgian town of Ypres was now the only sector where either side had a real chance of outflanking the enemy. Arriving from the Aisne on October 20th, Haig's First Corps advanced north of the village. Near Langemarck, they ran head-on into the German 24th and 26th Reserve Corps approaching from the northeast. Far from striking a decisive blow, the Allies became embroiled in a fluctuating encounter battle, during which they were compelled to feed in units piecemeal simply to hold their ground. On the German side, the patriotism of the young volunteer bourgeois German students rushed to the front could not disguise their limited training. They fell by the thousands at Langemarck, attacking in defense skirmish lines. They were cut to pieces by the Tommy riflemen and machine guns. 25,000 student soldiers found a home for eternity in a mass grave at Langemarck.
We ran approximately 100 yards when we came under a machine gun fire which was so terrific that the losses were so staggering that we got orders to lie down and to seek shelter. Nobody dared to lift his head because the very moment the machine gunners saw any movement, they let fly. And then the British artillery opened up. And the corpses, and the heads, and the arms, and the legs flew about, and we were cut to pieces.
Remembered by the Germans as the Kindermord von Ypern, massacre of the innocents at Ypres, their sacrifice was later accorded a special place in Nazi mythology. Although the front remained fluid, trenches were slowly snaking across the flat farmland. Aware by the evening of October 24th that the Reserve Corps assaults would probably fail, the German High Command decided to make a fresh attack a few miles further south, between Geljuvet and Messines. There, on October 29th, a task force under General von Fabeck renewed German efforts to achieve a breakthrough. The Allies experienced a major crisis on October 31st, when the British positions at Geljuvet were overrun. But, as at Langemarck, the Germans lost cohesion after the initial breach, again exposing weaknesses in their training. A bold counterattack by 357 officers and men of the 2nd Worcestershires drove the Germans from Geljuvet. Over the next few days, Allenby's cavalry and the French were pushed off Messines Ridge. The situation was stabilized, however, with the deployment of extra French troops on the BEF's flanks. Another assault on November 11th saw a composite Prussian Guard division break through the British lines just north of the Menin Road. Once more employing obsolete, tightly packed formations, the Germans were halted by a combination of point-blank British artillery fire and a scratch force which included cooks, headquarter clerks, and engineers. Not knowing that this represented the last line of British resistance, the Prussian Guard faltered and was then cleared from the Nuns' Woods by a vigorous counterattack by the 2nd Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. The Allies had survived the last crisis of 1914. Within a week or so, snow cloaked the battlefield, and the grandiose plans of the belligerents lay in ruins. The transfer of 4 German cavalry and 8 infantry divisions to the Eastern Front by early December underlined Falkenhayn's acknowledgement of the fact, and so did his officers in the trenches.
The war has got stuck into a gigantic siege on both sides. The whole front is one endless fortified trench. Neither side has the force to make a decisive push.
Despite gaining a great deal of valuable territory in Belgium and northern France, the Germans now face their ultimate nightmare, a prolonged two-front war, the very scenario they had sought to avoid.
Everyone is getting ready for a winter campaign. As far as I can judge, there is no possibility of an early finish.
2 days later, the same officer wrote,
"We are still stuck here for perfectly good reasons. One might as well say for perfectly bad reasons."
The original highly trained professional BEF was also gone. It had done much to halt the German drive on the Channel ports, but suffered 58,000 additional casualties between October 14th and November 30th. The forces of the British Empire had begun their long and bloody association with Ypres, where Allies occupied a hazardous salient dominated by German-held ridges.
Luckily for the Germans, their trenches were on the high ground, and therefore they could see a lot further, see the movement behind the Allied trenches, and also the drainage in that general area, particularly in Belgium, was particularly wet. So therefore, the British and the French couldn't dig very deep without their trenches becoming flooded. The Germans, on the other hand, had the option of going pretty deep. As the war progressed, the trenches themselves, which went from Switzerland all the way up to the North Sea, hundreds of miles, as the Germans were being pushed back, they were setting up more formidable defenses, such as the Hindenburg Line, which had a lot more concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, emplacements, tons of barbed wire, really a defense in depth to particularly slow down any advance that the Allies might be able to push through, and for them to immediately counterattack, which was one of their strong points as well.
Trench warfare was now a fact of life on the Western Front. On August 12th, the Austrians invaded Serbia with the belief that the multinational Habsburg army would crush the upstart Serbians in a quick and punitive manner. In 9 days of ferocious fighting, the Serbs threw the Austrians back across their start lines in the Battle of Jadar and advanced into Bosnia in hot pursuit. The Austrians fled in disorder. On September 7th, Potiorek tried again, forcing the overextended Serbs back out of Bosnia. By early November, it seemed that all was up. Sheer weight of numbers forced the Serbs to evacuate Belgrade on November 29th. On December 3rd, Putnik, having completed a withdrawal in good order to the southwest, turned and counterattacked on the line of the Kolubara River, with King Peter still in the front line with his rifle and 50 rounds of ammunition. The Austrians again fled in confusion. The third Austrian invasion had collapsed ignominiously, with the loss of 41,000 prisoners and 133 guns. The luckless Potiorek was replaced by the Archduke Eugene. The Serbian campaign had never been more than a sideshow to the Central Powers' great battle on the Russian front. Their war was fought on the grand scale. The larger portion of the Austro-Hungarian army marched east to meet the gathering Russian threat. These men marched with confidence, for it was a belief in Austria's ally Germany which bucked up morale. The rest of this army marched with less than enthusiasm, for most of them, almost 50%, were Southern Slavs, Ruthenes or Czechs. Few knew much more German than the 80 basic military commands. Many did not wish to join a fight for the glory of the decrepit Habsburg Empire. The German victory at Tannenberg gave the Austrian commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Conrad von Hotzendorf, delusions about an Austrian victory of the same caliber. Hotzendorf thought this opportunity was against the Russian southern group of armies. On September 3rd, the Russian and Austrian armies clashed at the town of Lemberg. The fighting was savage, with both sides inflicting massive numbers of casualties. But on September 11th, Hotzendorf accepted defeat. With huge casualty rates and over 100,000 men taken prisoner, Hotzendorf began his retreat of 200 miles due west. A significant blow had been landed on Austria-Hungary's reputation. German officers harshly observed,
"We are fettered to a corpse."
The Germans had every right to be concerned. The Austrians' inability to contain the Russian threat had serious implications for the Germans' battle plans on both fronts. The Russian pursuit of Hotzendorf's troops carried the Russians into the Carpathian mountain passes, but the Russians had coordination problems. When the Russian commanders met with the Grand Duke Nikolai on November 29th, General Ruzhki urged withdrawal almost all the way to the Vistula to regroup, resupply, and restore units battered at Lodz, and await the German attack he believed imminent. To do so would expose the Southwest Front's northern flank, obliging it also to withdraw. The Southwest Front commander, Ivanov, rejected that plan. His forces had stopped the Austrians north of Krakow and made considerable gains south and east of it, so he advocated another offensive. The Grand Duke accepted Ivanov's plan for the Ninth Army to attack Krakow from the north, and the Third from the south, each with 4 corps, while 2 corps of the Eighth Army maintained pressure in the Carpathians to prevent the Austrians reinforcing Krakow. Conrad's 4 understrength armies between the Vistula and Carpathians were outnumbered by almost 2 to 1. With Brusilov almost into Hungary, the dual monarchy's heartland was directly threatened. General Ross' 4 infantry and 3 cavalry divisions pushed forward on December 3rd through the 6th, forcing Radko Dmitriev to halt and seek Brusilov's help. Brusilov sent 8th and 24 Corps into Roth's right flank, and the battle entered its second phase on December 8th, the Russians now trying to outflank Roth from the east. They did not succeed, and the removal of 2 of Brusilov's corps left only 1 facing the entire Austrian Third Army. By December 15th, the Russians had retreated to a shorter line along the Dunajec River. Some Russian divisions had suffered 70% losses, and the Austro-Hungarians had proved more hard nut than soft underbelly. Austria held on, but she would never do as well again. On September 29th, while the Austrians were fighting at Lemberg, the Germans made a run for Warsaw, the operations center of the Russian army. On October 9th, an intercepted Russian radio message disclosed that 7 Russian corps was in the Warsaw area, waiting to spring a trap on the advancing 2 German corps. On October 10th, a copy of the Russian plan found on a dead officer showed Ludendorff that not only was the Ninth Army's left flank threatened from the Warsaw area, its right was also imperiled by the Russian Fourth and Ninth Armies from bridgeheads on the west bank of the Vistula. On October 11th, Ludendorff ordered von Mackensen to prepare for retreat. the Russians were now very strongly placed to pounce on von Mackensen. On the 19th, the Germans began to withdraw, and a week later, Ludendorff ordered a full-speed retreat of about 60 miles to a line between Kielce and Redon to avoid being encircled. By the end of October, the Russians had outrun their supplies, and the First Battle of Warsaw ended. The Germans had lost all their initial gains. Von Mackensen had evaded the Grand Duke's trap, but on the whole, the Russians had had the better of it. Winter arrived on the Russian plain and terminated all progress for all three armies. Men were satisfied to dig holes in the ground for shelter and wait for spring to begin moving again. Ludendorff reflected,
"The 1914 campaign had not brought a decision, and I could not see how one was to be reached in 1915.
In the winter of 1914, visions of a quick victory died on the cold Russian plain. As the Russians began to take stock of what had happened in the 1914 campaigns, the numbers were worse than that of the French. The devotion and tenacity exhibited by the Russian peasant soldier was often wasted by either corruption, errors in judgment, or heartbreaking shortages. However, the Tsar still believed in the cause.
My dear army have already given such proofs of valor that victory can't fail us now. We must dictate the peace, and I am determined to continue the war until the Central Powers are destroyed. No Congress or mediation for me."
The unshakable Tsar would have been served by placing his fate less in the hands of the army and more in the hands of the diplomats. With the onset of winter, the deadlock became total. Continuous trench lines now extended from the Belgian coast to the Swiss frontier. The Germans had not yet constructed the formidable defensive systems which, for most of the war, their overall strategy in the West would dictate. Having prepared for siege operations at the outset of the war, the Germans were comparatively well endowed with weapons suitable for trench warfare, including mortars, grenades, heavy guns, and howitzers. The BEF, however, was compelled to fashion improvised mortars from drain pipes and grenades from jam tins. All the armies were experiencing shell shortages. Falkenhayn later stated that the failure of just one ammunition train that winter threatened to render whole sections of the front defenseless. The French, requiring 50,000 rounds of 75mm ammunition daily, were producing only 11,000 rounds per day in mid-November 1914, while by January, some British 18-pound guns were restricted to firing just 4 rounds a day. Casualty rates in 1914 hit the BEF particularly hard. As a small professional volunteer force, it could ill afford the loss of 3,627 officers and 86,237 men between August and December 1914. In Britain, Kitchener, who foresaw a long and costly war, had begun a vast expansion of Britain's military forces. Forming a series of new armies, each of which duplicated the 6 divisions of the original BEF, more than 1,186,000 volunteers enlisted in the first 5 months, but they would take time to train. Meanwhile, the British soldiers at the front were struggling to hold the line. Musketry standards had already declined, and morale had slumped as the Germans made gains in minor operations at Givenchy in December. Christmas 1914 was marked by a spontaneous unofficial truce in Flanders, where German and British soldiers fraternized in no man's land, taking photographs, swapping souvenirs, and even playing football. On Christmas Eve, the soldiers in the field agreed not to fire on each other. That night, on a front where 5 days earlier there had been savage fighting, the guns fell silent. On the following morning, German soldiers walked across towards the British wire, and British soldiers went out to meet them.
Whole of no man's land, as far as we could see, was grey and khaki. There they were, smoking and talking, shaking hands, exchanging names and addresses after the war to write to one another.
The soldiers appeared with souvenirs, capstars, and badges. The British gave the Germans plum pudding. The Germans invited their enemy into their trenches and serenaded them with Christmas songs. When the Germans began to bury some of their frozen dead, the British soldiers had another shock.
They would put, the Germans, for Vaterland und Freiheit, for fatherland and freedom. And I said to a German, "Excuse me, but how can you be fighting for freedom? You started the war, and we are fighting for freedom." And he said, "Excuse me, English comrade, camarade, but we are fighting for freedom, for our country." And I say, you also put, "Here rests in God, an unbekannter, held. Here rests in God, an unknown hero, in God." Oh yes, God is on our side, but I said he's on our side. Well, English comrade, do not let us quarrel on Christmas Day.
The day after Christmas, infantrymen of both sides shouted warnings to their opposite number before opening fire. Hardening attitudes, as the war became increasingly bloody and impersonal, ensured that such incidents on this scale would not recur. But live and let live understandings accepted by both sides frequently prevailed in quiet sectors until the end of the war. Falkenhayn's decision in November 1914 to stand temporarily on the defensive in the West proved to be a huge mistake. A weakened and now inexperienced BEF might not have withstood further heavy blows during the winter. The respite granted by the Germans allowed the Allies to reorganize, giving Britain in particular the chance to train Kitchener's new armies and strengthen the BEF with additional territorial and Dominion contingents. Falkenhayn hoped that once the Russians had been pushed back over the Vistula, he would resume the offensive in the West. However, a combination of factors forced him to continue with a predominantly defensive operation as the new year began.
Up to your waist in water, up to your eyes in sludge, using the kind of language that makes the sergeant blush. All wouldn't join the army, that's what we all inquire. Don't we pity the poor civilians sitting around the fire? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. It's a lovely war. Don't be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pain. As soon as rebellion's gone, we feel just as heavy as lead, but we never get up to the sergeant brings the breakfast up to bed. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. What do we want with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam? Oh, balls right, son, how will we spend the money we earn? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the pay. As soon as the valley is gone, we feel just as heavy as lead, but we never get up to the sergeant brings our breakfast up to bed. What?